All right, diving in today, getting into some pretty fundamental stuff when it comes to really understanding your data.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking subqueries, sometimes called nested queries. And, I think a good way to visualize this is like if you were asking a detective to go and find a specific clue in a room, but first they have to figure out who even had access to that room in the first place.
Right.
That first question that you need answered before you can even start the main investigation is kind of what we're getting at today.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at the complete SQL masterclass, which you were kind enough to share with us.
It's a great resource. It introduces this idea of a subquery as a way to conduct some really sophisticated analysis, but all within a single query, so you're not having to jump around. It lets you
Oh,
do things like filter information based on what another query tells you, perform calculations on just specific parts of your data, and then ultimately it gives you a way to make these more complex comparisons.
so okay, let's unpack this a little bit. What at its core,
Yeah.
a subquery. The source material that we're looking at breaks it down as a query that lives entirely within another SQL query.
Right.
So these inner queries, they act as kind of like an engine. They're performing an initial task. Maybe it's calculating an average. Maybe it's pulling some specific list of IDs. But then the main outer query uses that result to do its primary job.
Yeah, it's like sending out a little research team first to gather some critical intel before the main analysis can even begin.
I like that.
Yeah, and a classic example from the material is finding employees who earn more than the average salary.
Okay.
Well, you can't really pinpoint those high earners until you actually know what the average is.
Right.
That's where the subquery comes in. It figures out that average for you first.
So it does the legwork.
It does.
Okay.
And what I think is so elegant about this approach is that it just streamlines so much of what could otherwise be a very complex data manipulation process.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to have a bunch of separate queries going on.
Exactly. You wouldn't need multiple queries, store those intermediate results somewhere, and then try to piece it all together manually. A subquery just lets you neatly package all that logic into a single statement.
Keep it clean.
Keep it clean, keep it readable, and ultimately that makes your code more maintainable.
So much better.
Much better. Yeah.
Now, it's not just a one-trick pony, right?
No, not at all.
The source material really emphasizes how versatile these subqueries are, mentioning that they can show up in various clauses, like select, from, where, and having.
That's a pretty wide range of applications.
It is.
And this is really what makes them so powerful. You know, they're not just some obscure feature. They're like deeply integrated into how you can actually structure and refine the entire process of getting data out of your database.
Sorry, we've established the what. Now let's get into the how.
Okay.
The source material breaks subqueries down into three main types. We've got scalar subqueries, row subqueries, and table subqueries.
Right.
Let's start with those scalar subqueries. What sets them apart?
Well, a scalar subquery, it's kind of right there in the name. It's designed to return a single solitary value.
Okay.
Think of it like asking a question that only has one definitive answer.
Got it.
And that average salary calculation we were talking about just a moment ago, that's a perfect example.
Okay.
You know, you've got that subquery, something like select AVG, salary from employees. That's just going to give you back one number,
Right.
the average across all the employee salaries and that single value. Then you can use it directly in your where clause of the main query. Maybe you're comparing it to something.
Okay, so it's a very focused question.
Yes,
With one very precise answer.
precisely.
Now, what about those row subqueries? They sound like they're giving us back a bit more information.
They do. Instead of just a single value, they'll return a single row.
Okay.
But the key here is that the row can contain multiple columns.
Okay.
The source actually gives a really good example. It talks about finding the employee who has the absolute maximum salary in each department. So your subquery here would actually select both the department ID and the maximum salary within that department,
Okay.
giving you back a single row for each department. But then the outer query can use that to do further comparisons, maybe figure out which employee is actually associated with that maximum salary.
Interesting.
Yeah, it lets you basically do comparisons based on multiple attributes at the same time.
Right.
And across those different groups in your data.
Okay, so scalar gives us one value.
Yep.
Row gives us one row, but potentially with several values.
Several pieces of information, right?
Okay, that leaves us with table subqueries.
Yes,
And I mean, these sound like they're going to return a whole table.
they do.
Right.
A table subquery returns an entire set of data. Could be one or more rows, one or more columns. It's essentially like creating a temporary table right there in your query.
Like a table within a table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The material uses this example of first selecting all the employees who were hired after a specific date. Let's say 2020-01-001, and then using that result set of employees, it goes on to calculate the average salary per department.
Okay.
So the subquery is acting like a filter first.
Right.
It's creating this temporary, more focused data set. And then the outer query operates on that derived table to do the rest of the analysis.
Okay.
And this is so useful when you really need to narrow down your data first before you start doing things like aggregate functions or more complex operations.
So you're creating this little mini specialized table just for the needs of your main query.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay. Very efficient.
Very efficient, yeah.
So we've got the ability to get a single value, a single row, or whole table back as a result from these nested queries.
That's right.
Now let's actually see how these different types get implemented within the structure of a SQL query.
Okay.
Your source walks us through using these subqueries in the from, the, where, and the having clauses.
Mm-hmm.
So starting with that select clause,
Well,
how can we use subqueries to enhance the information that we're actually getting back?
Well, in the select clause, you typically use those scalar subqueries. Remember the ones that return a single value?
Yeah.
You use them to bring in something like an aggregate value or maybe some other single piece of information and display it alongside each row that comes back from your main query.
Okay.
So the source gives this example of calculating the overall average salary across all your employees using a subquery, and then you include that average as a new column in your results, right next to each employee's individual salary.
Oh, that's great for a comparison.
It is. It gives you this immediate side-by-side comparison.
Yeah, you can see how they stack up.
Exactly.
Now, what about the from clause? The source mentions this idea of derived tables or inline views. What's happening there?
So this is where it gets kind of interesting.
Okay.
When you put a subquery in the from clause, you're essentially defining a temporary table.
Yeah.
And it gets to be called a derived table or an inline view.
Okay.
But the point is, this temporary table is then treated just like any other table in your database for the purpose of that main query. The source's example of finding the average salary of employees hired after 2021-01, that really illustrates this well.
Right.
You know, the subquery first filters the employees table to only include those who were hired after that date.
Okay.
And that filtered result, that's your derived table.
Okay.
And then the outer query uses that to calculate the average salary, maybe even grouped by department.
Oh, so you're essentially like custom building a data set
Exact.
after that analysis.
On the fly, tailored to exactly what you need.
That's so cool.
It is pretty cool.
Now, the where clause, that seems like kind of the most intuitive place to use a subquery, especially when we're talking about filtering data based on some condition.
Yeah, this is probably one of the most common and powerful applications of subqueries.
Okay.
In the where clause, the subquery typically gives you back either a single value or a set of values. And then the where clause itself uses those comparison operators, you know, the equals, greater than, less than, the and operator, not in, or maybe some combination of those with any or all, to filter the rows of that outer query based on whatever the subquery gave you.
Based on that result.
Exactly. And that very first example we talked about, finding employees with above average salaries where the subquery calculates the average, that's a perfect example of a subquery in the where clause acting as that filter.
So it's determining what gets included.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so where is for filtering individual rows based on whatever comes out of that subquery.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about having? The source points out that it's similar in purpose, but it's operating on grouped data.
That's the key difference.
Okay.
The having clause, it filters groups of rows, but it does this after they've been formed using a group by Y clause.
Okay.
So this is where you would use subqueries to set conditions on those aggregated results.
Right.
The source gives this example of finding departments where the average salary is greater than the overall average salary. First, the data gets grouped by department.
Right.
And the average salary for each department is calculated. And then that having clause, it's got a subquery inside, fetches the overall average salary, and it filters out any departments that don't meet that condition.
So having is after the grouping.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've seen how subqueries can fit into all these different parts of a SQL query to achieve different goals.
Right.
To make this even more concrete, your source gives us some real-world scenarios in the context of an online store.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through a couple of those just to see how this all comes together in practice?
Sure. Let's say you're running an online store and you want to figure out which products are your real star performers, the ones with sales figures way above average.
Okay.
You could use a subquery in the where clause to first calculate that average sales figure across all products.
Okay.
And then your main query selects the product names and their sales, but only for those where the sales are greater than maybe 1.5 times that calculated average.
So you'd see your top performers.
Exactly. It highlights those standouts.
Okay, what's another example from the source that brings this to life?
Well, another really common need is understanding customer spending habits.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to find those customers who are placing orders that are worth a lot more than the average.
Okay, you big spenders.
Your big spenders, yeah. So again, a subquery in that where clause would first figure out what the average order value is.
Okay.
And then the outer query would grab the customer IDs and their total order values, but only for those who are exceeding that average by a certain amount.
And you could target them for marketing or something?
Exactly. You could tailor your marketing, give them special offers, really cultivate those relationships.
Okay, these are great examples. Seeing how powerful subqueries can be.
Absolutely.
Give me one more from that online store context.
All right, well, let's say you want to compare how different departments within your company are performing.
Okay.
You could use a subquery inside a having clause to find the departments where the average employee's salary in that department is higher than the company-wide average.
Oh, interesting. This could tell you things like which departments have more specialized roles or maybe more generous compensation structures.
Oh, I see. Valuable insight.
Very valuable, yeah.
Now, your source also makes this really important distinction between subqueries and another key tool in SQL, JOINs. What's the key difference there that we should understand?
Both are incredibly powerful for manipulating data, but they serve different primary purposes.
Okay.
A subquery is really all about getting back a specific piece of data. It could be a single value, it could be a set of rows. But the point is that result then gets used as a condition or a value within the main query.
Got it.
It's like getting an answer to a preliminary question to inform the main investigation.
Okay.
A JOIN, on the other hand, that's designed to combine rows from two or more tables based on a related column.
Okay.
So it's more about bringing together different data sets based on some shared information to get a more holistic view.
So subqueries are about getting a specific result to use within a single query's logic.
And joins are more about merging data from different tables based on that shared information.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a helpful distinction.
Yeah.
Now, as we start to wrap up our dive here, the source briefly mentions a more advanced concept called correlated subqueries.
Ah,
What are those, and why are they considered more advanced?
so correlated subqueries introduce this dependency between the inner query and the outer query.
Okay.
Unlike the ones we've been talking about so far, which are independent and execute just once, a correlated subquery actually relies on values from the outer query for its execution.
It's dynamic.
It is. It means that the inner query might potentially run once for each row processed by the outer query.
Oh.
The example that the material gives is finding employees whose salary is greater than the average salary, but specifically within their own department.
So it's changing each time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for each employee that the outer query looks at the inner query, actually recalculates that average salary just for that employee's department.
Wow.
It's very powerful for doing very granular row-level comparisons, but because it might execute multiple times, it can impact performance, which is why it's considered a bit more advanced.
Okay, I see. It's powerful, but you got to use it carefully.
Exactly.
So to sum up what we've learned today about subqueries,
Okay.
they're queries nested inside other queries. And we've seen how they function in all these different parts of a SQL statement to do things like filter, calculate, and even define those temporary data sets.
Yep.
We looked at scalar, row, and table subqueries. We examined their use in select, from, where, and having. And we grounded it all in those real-world examples of managing that online store.
If we zoom out and think about what this means for you, understanding subqueries really equips you to interact with data in a much more nuanced way and pull out meaningful insights.
But at a higher level.
It is. It's like you graduate from just retrieving basic data to asking and answering much more intricate questions.
I like that.
You know, whether you're trying to pinpoint trends within specific customer segments or compare how different product categories are performing, or really drill down into the factors that are driving particular outcomes, this ability to construct those nested queries gives you a serious advantage.
Now, the source material also touches on some other common data analysis questions. You know, finding the second highest salary, or identifying customers who haven't made any purchases, or calculating year-over-year revenue changes. It highlights that subqueries can be used to address all of these challenges.
That's right.
Although it does mention that there might be alternative ways to achieve those things too.
Yes, like window functions or more complex joins, but it really just shows how versatile SQL can be.
And how many problem-solving tools you have in your toolkit.
Precisely.
So as a challenge to our listeners,
Hmm.
think about the kinds of data that you encounter in your own work, or maybe just areas that you're interested in.
Okay.
What are some specific questions that you have about that data that might need this kind of multi-step approach?
Right.
Could you break those questions down into a main inquiry and then one or more of those supporting sub-inquiries?
Hmm.
What pieces of information would you absolutely need to know in order to get to the answer you're looking for?
It's a great exercise.
It is.
Yeah.
And as you continue to work with data, remember that these subqueries are a great way to ask those more complex questions and really uncover those deeper levels of insight. They encourage this very layered and logical approach to data exploration.
They do.
So as a final thought, think about where else this idea of nesting questions or processes might be a powerful strategy. And I'm talking outside of the world of data.
Okay.
Are there parallels in scientific inquiry and project management, or even just in your everyday decision-making, where breaking down a complex problem into these smaller layers could help you find more effective solutions? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Any